Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the University of Plymouth. Thank you for joining us this evening, albeit virtually, for this special Future 21 talk that I'm going to be delivering this evening. I'm your host, Professor James Daybell. I'm Professor of Early Modern British History at the University of Plymouth, and it is an absolute pleasure to have been invited to talk to you about recent research that I've been doing. And the title of my talk is going to be Lost Childhoods, the Cultural History of Separation. I'm going to give a short bit of housekeeping now, just so that you know the structure of things. The talk has already been filmed. It's been filmed over a week ago. So it will be live streamed to you in a few minutes, which means that I'm in the bizarre position of actually being able to join you and watch myself deliver the lecture. It will last, I'm told, for about 56 minutes. So apologies for that. I know it's the end of a week, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. You'll get something out of it. And then I'll come back on screen and I will answer any questions that you've got. And if you have questions, please do pop them in the chat. But before we go to the live stream feed, and I'm sorry that this is online in COVID conditions and we're coming out of lockdown, but it still seems much easier to do these things online rather than in person. But before we do that, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background to myself, because I think it will help frame the talk that you're going to hear. I am trained as an early modern historian. I'm a historian of the 16th and 17th century, primarily Britain and Europe. I specialize in women, gender, political culture. Lately, I've been working on material objects. In particular, I'm writing a book on gloves at the moment with the wonderful Susan Broomhall, who is based in Melbourne in Australia. I'm also one half with Sam Willis, the TV historian and naval historian of Histories of the Unexpected, the history brand, the history podcast, something that has really taken me out of my historical comfort zone over the last few years and has meant that I've had to sort of range across vast periods, topics and regions. And it's really bringing that all together that's led me to start working on the history of separation. I can talk to you a bit more about that sort of broader canvas in questions afterwards, but I mention it now because I think what it does is it gives you a framework to understand where I'm coming from when I'm talking about separation between children and parents. And this talk that I'm going to give tonight fits into the first section of the book, which looks at separation across the life cycle. It looks at children, it looks at marriage, it looks at old age, and it looks at death, so the ultimate separation of individuals. So this fits slap bang in the start. And what I'm really interested in is I'm interested in looking at those structural factors that over time led to separation. So things like poverty, power, state, ideology, politics, empire, all of these are the sort of underpinnings that separate individuals. And at the root of it, I'm interested in uncovering not only the reasons why this happened, but also the experience, and particularly the emotional experience of why this happened. I am avowedly a historian rather than a psychologist. So my training is in history. My methods are in history. It was lovely to read the Facebook comments from so many people and so much interest in this talk. There were one individual who wrote a veritable essay on the topic, which was lovely to see. There's so many ideas, so many ways you could go with this. You go down the route of boarding schools, the Magdalene sisters, so those Irish Catholic laundries. What I've chosen to do, though, is concentrate for this on three particular case studies. And I'm interested in issues of abandonment, stolen and lost generations. And of course, this must come with a warning that, of course, some of the things that you're going to hear about are deeply upsetting. But really, to give you another sort of handle on this, I'm going to be looking firstly at abandoned children through the lens of the London Foundling Hospital. I'm then going to be looking at a stolen generation, in Australia, so Aboriginal children. And then I'm going to be looking at the lost generation of Chinese teenagers during the Cultural Revolution in China, and sort of trying to draw those ideas, some sort of core themes out of that. One could, of course, go in all sorts of directions and see parallels across time, across countries. We could look at Native Americans in North America. We could look at the Jewish experience of children during the Holocaust. But for the moment, I will stop talking, and you can ask me much more about this later on. And I hand you over to my pre-recorded self, who is going to talk to you about lost childhood, the cultural history of separation. So I will see you in about 56 minutes for what I hope is going to be an interesting half an hour of conversations and chat. Hello everyone, I'm James Daybell, Professor of Early Modern British History at the University of Plymouth, and it gives me great pleasure to be speaking to you as part of this Futures 2021 event. And I'm going to be talking about something that derives from a brand new research project on the cultural history of separation. And it comes from the first section, which deals with the family and life cycle. I'm going to be talking to you about the separation of parents and children in the past. The title of my talk is Lost Childhoods, the Cultural History of Separation, and this is its first outing, so it's hot off the press, as it were. I'd like to start with a contemporary hook. On the 1st of July 2021, Louise Bear, Mohawk Bear clan mother of the Iroquois Confederacy, travelled to Parliament Hill in Ottawa to address Mark Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services and member of the Canadian Parliament, following the discovery of more than 1,000 unmarked graves believed to belong to Indigenous children found at the site of former residential homes in British Columbia and Saskatchewan. Demanding answers for why these terrible acts were covered up, Louise Bear used the symbolism of Canada Day to invoke mother law and take back the name Canada, which was derived from the Iroquois language. Her powerful speech is worth quoting at some length. We arrive here today to ask for the original peace that we had originally agreed on and to return to an original relationship and understanding between our countries. And so I ask you today, on behalf of your Parliament, on behalf of you being the face of the country that built its wealth on the blood of our babies, I ask you why. Why did your country try and hide such a premeditated, heinous act to take the innocent blood of our babies and create your wealth and then use our language in your infancy to name yourself? I ask you. We know why, but I want to hear it from you, because there can't be healing unless we understand why. We're in a moment of history where we need to right the wrongs, and so, with the authority invested in me to name and non-name, I ask you to answer my question. If you are unable to answer me, then I invoke the authority that I have, that I can take our name of Canada back and put in my basket, and you'll be a nameless country. From the 1870s to the 1990s, an estimated 150,000 First Nations, Inuit and Métis children aged between 4 and 16 years old were removed from their families and forced to attend Indian residential schools in Canada with the express purpose of assimilating them into society, forcing them to abandon their language, culture and way of life. Funded and run by the government and Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic and United Churches. Some 139 such establishments were operated throughout most Canadian provinces and territories, the last school closing only in 1996. Forced to endure a regimen of academic learning, religious prayer and chores, the conditions in these institutions were brutal and cruel, with children exposed to harsh punishments, violence and sexual abuse. These widespread practices cut deep into the lives and psyche of First Nations people in terms of psychological impact of separation of families, the forcible acculturation and erasure of Indigenous identities and heritage, and the inhumane treatment of innocents, which resulted in an estimated
100,000 children dying from disease, neglect and other causes. The discovery of these mass graves perpetuates the continual marginalisation of First Nation peoples who feel segregated in Canada, contributing further to a painful legacy of trauma. The cumulative layering of separation here is so palpable. Children separated from their parents, First Nations people separated within their homeland, the Canadian nation separated from its name. This symbolic act of entreaty, I would argue, entangles history, identity, emotions, psychological trauma and politics, and opens up many of the central themes that I want to explore around the history of child-parent separation, which sits within a broader cultural and global history of separation. Throughout history, the separation of parents and children has been ubiquitous, a quotidian lived experience of everyday life connected to life cycle, which occasioned anxiety and trauma. For Sigmund Freud, the separation anxiety experienced by young children parted from mothers was one of the most traumatic psychological events of their early years. When young children between the ages of about 12 months to 4 years are removed from their mothers to be with strangers, their behaviour is thought, according to Freud's attachment theory, to go through 3 main stages as they respond to this kind of unfamiliar and threatening situation. In the wake of this Freudian analysis, an industry of psychoanalysts, including John Bowlby and others since the 1950s, has spilt much ink on discussing the effects of maternal deprivation upon children. Viewed historically, separation from parents and siblings is an inevitable rite of passage within traditional Western patterns of family life. As children get older, they go to school, start apprentices, eventually leave home to set up lives themselves, enter the world of work, or venture to university, potentially to a gap year, a peculiarly British and perhaps elitist remnant of the 18th century Grand Tour. The experience of living apart was also shaped by architectural spaces or built environments. Foster homes, orphanages, residential children's homes, boarding schools, colleges, universities, which structured how people lived their lives in material and haptic ways. Separation of parents and children was not simply an inevitable part of the aging process, but also enforced by circumstance, such as the death of parents or economic adversity, with poverty leaving some parents with no choice but to abandon their children. At a macro level, large-scale forces like war, migration, segregation, and genocide tore families apart and left orphans. In many cases, separation was enforced. Across cultures and across continents, the state has intervened in different ways within the family unit to remove children from the custody of parents they deemed unfit, often forcibly taking children for political, ideological, and racial reasons. In a brilliant recent book entitled Taking Children, the historian Laura Briggs shows that the United States has a long tradition of state intervention to remove children from the custody of parents who they deemed to be undesirable, whether these be slave children separated from families at the auction block, Native American and black children seized from negligent parents, Latin American children of suspected communists taken from families, or crack babies taken from junkie mothers. And more up to date, the Trump administration's separation of children and families seeking asylum in the United States, a rather sadistic and politically motivated form of terror, in this case to instill fear in particular groups of people. For such children and their parents, the experience of separation was traumatic, even violent. Now, writing a cultural history of a phenomenon as broad and nebulous as separation of children requires a flexible approach that fuses detailed micro-histories, stories of individuals and groups, alongside sweeping narratives of historical change. With human experience at the fore, the talk constantly readjusts its historical lens to focus on the local and the personal before zooming out to examine the clash of ideas and forces, geographies and cultures over time in one large, fomenting whirl of history. The breadth of the historical canvas necessitates a bricolage approach, whereby a detailed picture is created by analysis of an array of historical sources. Frustratingly, in many ways, the child's point of view is extraordinarily intractable. However, residual echoes of children past can be heard through a close and imaginative reading of personal writings, material objects, and also by using oral histories where the psychological impact on children is sifted from within adult reminiscence. In this talk, I'm interested in examining the different kinds of circumstance that structured separation by focusing on 3 case studies: on abandoned children, abandoned foundlings in 18th and 19th century London arising from poverty and illegitimacy. Secondly, the stolen generation of Aboriginal children in Australia resulting from the state desire to assimilate and eradicate indigenous peoples and culture. And finally, the lost generation during China's Cultural Revolution who were sent to the countryside as part of Chairman Mao's communist reforms. Common themes and patterns emerge through these seemingly disparate studies: disruption to the family unit and mother-child bonds, trans-historical feelings and emotional experiences of parents and children, issues of trauma, dislocation, and the loss of childhood, fractured memory and identity, as well as resonances and enduring legacies with the present relating to reconciliation, forgiveness, and healing. The first case study looks at separation of children from parents through the lens of the London Foundling Hospital, which was set up in 1739 by the philanthropist Thomas Coram to care for babies at risk of abandonment due to poverty, misfortune, and illegitimacy. The early 18th century saw the appearance of Jonathan Swift's satirical A Modest Proposal, published in 1729, in which he suggested eating children as a way of solving Ireland's economic problems and alleviating the poor. And reportedly over 1,000 unwanted babies were found discarded on London's dung heaps. At the same time, Britain was out of step with the rest of Europe. Institutions to look after infants had been round since medieval orphanages, and the history of abandoned children stretches back to classical antiquity and the figure of the foundling in the pastoral tale Daphne and Chloe. Practices of receiving children, however, varied from place to place. In Venice, newborns were left in a tiny boat only accessible down a narrow alleyway to ensure discretion of mothers dropping them off. Dublin's Foundling Hospital featured a revolving basket at the gate in which mothers could deposit their children and then swing it round so that the children ended up inside. While in Florence, in Brunelleschi's Hospital of the Innocents, babies were placed in a basin similar to those used for holy water, located outside the orphanage walls. Coram's hospital, then, was a timely attempt to deal with an acute social problem. When the Foundling Hospital first opened its doors in 1741, the demand from unfortunate mothers was overwhelming. During the first years, over 100 women a week attempted to gain admission for their children, despite the fact that there were only a handful of beds in what were temporary premises. Demand seriously outstripped supply. Of an estimated 2,500 children brought to the hospital on admission days between January 1750 and December 1755, only 783 were able to be admitted. In order to alleviate the restricted places, there followed a period of indiscriminate admission, which was funded by the government between 1756 and 1760, during which time some 16,326 children were admitted. This huge influx of babies put enormous strain on the institution's infrastructures, with a devastating social cost. Of the number of children admitted, only 40% survived during these 5 years, and as a result, the hospital received public criticism, a loss of government funding and support, donations from wealthy benefactors dried up, and this greatly affected the institution's ability to provide for abandoned children. With financially diminished resources, a new system of admission was introduced from 1760 with a ballot system to control intake. Unlike the Paris Foundling Hospital, where mothers could leave their baby anonymously at the gate, the London Foundling Hospital now also required mothers to petition for their child to be admitted, explaining their personal circumstances. And these are incredible documents. The balloting system effectively meant that the fate of tens of thousands of children became a matter of chance, with only a lucky minority received into the hospital. The admission system worked as followed. A notice advertising for exposed and deserted young children would be posted on the hospital gates, and it would invite those wishing to gain admission for their child to deliver a petition to the secretary. If their petition was deemed acceptable, then the applicant was invited to attend a service on the next Saturday with their child to take part in a ballot. The ballot itself took place in the chapel, it was supervised by the governors, and there were spectators in the gallery. 2 foundling children holding a bag or box of balls approached the mothers congregated, cradling their babies, and they were asked to pick out one ball. If they drew a white ball, it meant that their child was admitted, while if they drew a black ball, it signalled they'd been unsuccessful. There was no room for them at all. And failure on one occasion did not prevent mothers from trying again, as can be seen from a petition by a woman named Frances Barnes to the hospital's governors. "I unfortunately drew a black ball," she explained, begging them to allow her to take the second chance of a ballot at the next reception of children, as your petitioner, being only a poor servant and has only £4 a year wages, has rendered her incapable of maintaining herself and child out of it. Mothers' petitions, like Frances Barnes, were treated confidentially and survive in their thousands among the hospital's archives, a remarkable record of the complex circumstances that forced large numbers of women to relinquish their newborn babies. Reading through these heartbreaking supplications, one is struck by the grinding level of poverty and unfortunate circumstances such women encountered, including death, disease, unemployment, abandonment, unwanted pregnancies, betrayal, seduction, and illegitimacy. And something of the emotional struggle involved in surrendering children into care is witnessed in the petition of Sarah Hall, which is in our next slide, dated the 1st of June 1799, which describes a series of misfortunes she experienced since the age of 5. "I'm sorry to be thus unfortunate and particular, as it is entirely out of my power to support it, as the father is absent. To add to my misfortune, I have been deprived of parents ever since I have been 5 years old, and have not a friend to apply to, and know not in what manner to support the infant, and I have thus been so unfortunate and only been a servant since I was 14. Despite the emotional potency of this maternal plea, the strong impression of this and countless others like it is that the women who gave up their children did so not because of some kind of emotional indifference, but rather in order to help them to a better life. Many women struggled emotionally with the decision to be separated from their children, struggled to do so, and there's significant evidence of maternal affection among the archives. And perhaps the most remarkable testimony of motherly love comes in the form of humble tokens that accompanied children on deposit, which are the subject of a stunning exhibition and book, Threads of Feeling, by historian John Stiles. In some cases, these were personal objects, things like coins or jewellery or medals, which were used to identify the child if a mother wished to reclaim him or her. And throughout the 1740s to the 1760s, however, the most common form of token was for mothers to cut a piece of fabric, either from their own clothing or from that of their baby, which the hospital then attached to registration forms or billets, using them as a form of identification, and they then became part of the institution's records bound into ledgers. And the depositing of tokens was no longer required after the 1760s, but the practice was so well entrenched that it continued informally, so much so that by 1790, There were over 18,000 tokens in the hospital's collections. One touching example, which we can see in the slide, is a bunch of 4 silk ribbons coloured yellow, blue, green and pink and tied in a knot, found on an abandoned girl who became foundling number 170 when she was admitted on the 9th of December 1743. The hospital named her Pamela Townley, and she died in her 3rd year of life on the 1st of September 1746. And while we know nothing of the precise circumstances that drove her mother to part with her baby and deposit her at the hospital, this humble gift of needlework testifies, I think, something of the strong emotional bonds that existed for her newborn child. Attached to another token was a handwritten note expressing a mother's grief in parting permanently from her child. It reads, "I cannot maintain her, for her father is gone for 2 years and left me no money, and I out of business. This token is to remember my girl forever." And several tokens took the form of poems written in the first person from the perspective of the child, and these appealed to benefactors to look after the foundling. An exemplary is the following touching verse written on the 6th of September 1755. "My helpless situation loudly cries, extend compassion to an infant's size, despise me, not search but antiquity, heroes whose acts and noble history are stolen embrace, their births like me, a foundling sprung from the fairy festival made, and the first foundation of Rome's empire laid. And would you listen to a babe's request, grant me, unweaned, my native food, the breast." I mean, one can't help just shudder when you read, such a sort of eloquent poem coming out of the mouth of a child. These tokens and thousands like them poignantly represent the moment of parting between mother and child, and when combined with the skeletal details in the hospital's biographical ledger, they echo whispers of these children down the centuries. Some mothers doubtless simply turned away and forgot their offspring, never to return to those gates after they deposited them, while others buried troubled feelings deep inside as a form of self-preservation. For many, though, those whose voices and feelings can be recovered from the hospital's vast records, it was not simply a case of forgetting. They wanted to maintain some sort of contact with their child after admission, and hundreds of letters survive, especially for the Victorian period, from mothers wanting to know how their children were faring, asking permission to come and visit, inquiring whether or not their children were still alive, or, in a minority of cases, even wanting to reclaim their offspring. A servant, simply named Sarah T., wrote in response to the news of the death of her dear little girl in 1858. "I am truly grieved and pained to hear of the death of my dear little girl, but in the midst of my grief I'm consoled that that dear little spirit is happy forever. It has pleased God to take her to himself, and she is now spared from all her troubles and trials of this life." Another maternal plea dated 1864 reads, "Do please tell me if it is possible for me to see my darling baby. If it is not permitted, then I must try to bear all my troubles. If I could only hold my baby in my arms, but for a short time, my life would be so much happier." The hospital's letter books for the period 1860 to 1930 are unique records of how mothers coped with separation from their children, occasionally offering glimpses of children's reactions as well. Regulations during this period worked to keep mothers and children apart, and despite requests, governors refused to divulge information about their parentage to foundlings unless the mothers gave express permission, and this was in order to protect the mothers' reputations. Conversely, mothers were also not permitted to visit or contact children directly, nor could they have locks of hair, nor could they have photographs of their children at this stage. They could, however, inquire about children's health as often as they wanted, and even send them toys and money. And one mother sent her son 5 shillings every month throughout the decade of the 1920s. However, they could not meet or write to the children themselves until agreed upon by the hospital authorities and subsequently by the children themselves. And this particular dynamic allows us to look at motherhood from afar, so mothers who were distanced from their children, trying to be mothers through separation. And it emphasizes the suffering experienced by poor women who, unlike their higher class counterparts, had to work really hard to ensure that separation was not permanent, something made all the more difficult by their poverty. Now, letters and gifts of this sort sent to children in care afforded some way of keeping in touch during separation, but this was clearly a poor substitute for physical contact and being at a child's bedside, for example, when they were unwell. A small number of mothers never reconciled to the loss of their children and laboured hard in an attempt to reclaim them. More often than not, such hopes were dashed by misfortune and poverty. One mother, who signed herself simply as MH, described in letters dating from 1862 to 1863 how she hoped to work hard enough to be able to afford to support her daughter. She wrote, "I thought I would try and save a little money and see if I could take a little shop for both of us. I was therefore very careful, making the best of every penny." Her dreams, however, unfortunately came to nothing, and she was beset by ill health, compounded by a second pregnancy to another father who then deserted her. In a small minority of cases, mothers applied to reclaim their children, with others meeting their son or daughter once they had come of age. This, of course, was conditional upon the mother undergoing an investigation. The authorities wanted to check her reasons for wanting to see the child, and it was also conditional on the child's agreement. The authorities wanted to safeguard foundlings from mothers who might seek to take advantage of them financially, and children also refused to acknowledge a mother's presence, often with great sort of pent-up feelings of anger at having been given away. Sometimes, however, children initiated introductions themselves, especially where their curiosity was aroused by the receipt of regular gifts and money from an unknown benefactor. A woman who signed herself AMG contemplated applying to reclaim her daughter several times between 1918 and 1929, but was prevented by various mishaps, including the death of her fiancé during the First World War. Despite various setbacks, she continued to inquire about her daughter and sent her gifts, so much so that in February 1929, her daughter, Kate V, asked whether her presents were from her mother and whether, if they were, it would be possible to meet her. And the secretary explained to Kate, "Perhaps when you are a little older, things may be different and you may be introduced to her," asking her to continue on, basically in her station. In the end, Kate's patience was rewarded, and in April 1931, or over 2 years later, she and her mother finally met, and the secretary reported simply that the meeting had been a success. There are no further details, and that's something that's particularly tantalizing. Reunions, however, did not always go well, and some of the main problems encountered were the difficulty of missing the earliest years of a child's life and development, as well as negative reactions from children. The strongest evidence that survives documents the suffering of mothers, as I think we've seen. Much more difficult to access is the experience and feelings of the children themselves. Viewed from the child's perspective, the reality was that they experienced multiple separations across their early lives. First, they were abandoned as newborn babies or infants, and while they may have developed early bonds with their mothers, they certainly would have had no clear memory of them. Once admitted to the foundling hospital and processed, they were then immediately fostered out to wet nurses who were responsible for bringing them up through infancy. Many died at this stage, as I commented upon earlier, but those who survived grew up thinking that these wet nurses were in effect their mothers. And what this meant was that they then experienced a second separation when they were of schooling age and returned to the foundling hospital. A third stage of separation came when the children were apprenticed out, when they left the institution that had been their juvenile home to go into domestic service, if they were girls, or for boys to go into trade and the military. And children's attitudes towards their environment can be pieced together from the records of runaways and delinquents, or glanced at in correspondence with governors. The fact that the hospital, however, continued until 1954, so it had a huge history, also means that we're able to access the memories of foundlings who in adulthood remember their childhoods in care. And oral histories of adults who were foundling between the two world wars suggest that among boys especially, they experienced loneliness and a sense of isolation. In a study entitled Growing Up Alone, Barbara Prynne highlights the prevalence with which children move from one place to another or from one caregiver to another, a process that was seldom mediated by adults. Instead, children had to make sense of these experiences by themselves. And the stories they told about this period in their lives are expressed with emotion and often tinged with feelings of great sadness and loss. Charles Nalden, who was brought up in the care of the Foundling Hospital from his birth until the early 20th century, remembers, "It would have been more humanitarian had we been institutionalized from the day of our reception into the hospital, which in my own case would have been at around 3 weeks old." As with many other children, he found it difficult leaving the nurse who'd cared for him since infancy, and the bonds that developed between the foster mother and infant made it difficult for him to transition into the hospital and made the nurses reluctant to want to let their infants go. In light of allegations about child abuse taking place in children's homes in recent years and the brutal and sadistic treatment of vulnerable children, the popular view has been that foster care is a much better way of caring for homeless children. This supported new fields of inquiry into child psychology, which since 1945 highlighted the detrimental effects of institutional care on children. Oral histories are also one of the most important sources for understanding the plight of the stolen generation of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders who were taken from their homes in Australia during the period 1905 up to the 1970s. And this is the next case study that I want to talk to you about. During these years, up to 100,000 mixed-race children were removed from Aboriginal parents, either summarily, taken without warning when families were absent, sometimes even snatched from the arms of mothers, or by mid-century, removed through legal proceedings. One confidential account compiled for the Bringing Them Home inquiry describes the removal of 8 siblings removed from Cape Barren Island in Tasmania in the 1960s. And the text of this is on the next slide. And the children were all fostered separately, all 8 of them. So the next thing I remember was that they took us from there, and we went to the hospital, and I kept asking because the children were screaming and the little brothers and sisters were just babies, of course, and I couldn't move. They were all around me, around my neck and legs, yelling and screaming. I was all upset and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know where we were going. I just thought, well, they're police, they must know what they're doing. I suppose I've got to go with them. They're taking me to see Mum. You know, this is what I honestly thought. They kept us in hospital for 3 days, and I kept asking, when are we going to see Mum? And no one told us at the time. And I think on the 3rd or 4th day, they piled us in a car, and I said, where are we going? And they said, we're going to see your mother. But then we turned left to go to the airport, and I got a bit panicky about where we were going. They got hold of me. You know, what I mean, I got this little baby in my arms, and they put us on a plane, and they told us we were going to see my mum, so I thought she must be wherever they're taking us. Vivid personal stories of this nature record the fate of Indigenous peoples as part of a widespread and systematic attempt at re-socialization, and in the eyes of the state, to better assimilate Aboriginal peoples into modern Australian society. Listening to their voices and reading their words, one is struck by the strength and fortitude with which families dealt with this separation, and with which children experienced a diversity of care situations, from institutionalization in schools and missions, placement in foster homes, or adoption by white couples. As we can see in the next slide, we can see one of these homes and these children. Many conformed outwardly to their new lives, while at night time inwardly showing great distress and emotional pain. Mothers buried memories deep inside their hearts, or traditionally imposed a sorry silence, which culturally was normally reserved for mourning the dead. Through this later testimony, historians can recover the voices of these stolen children, which are heard with a magnitude and emotional force. Repeatedly, one gains a profound insight into the impact of these separations on the children themselves in a way that is well nigh impossible for 18th and 19th century foundlings. Bob Randall, who was born in 1934 in Angus Downs in Northern Territory, remembers his removal by police as a young child to the bungalow in Alice Springs. He was then sent to Darwin around 1943, then to Goulburn and Croker Island. He also never saw his parents again. Recalling these events, he describes the incomprehensible wound to the spirit separation caused, and we have the script here. So what you've got is not only the biological ripping away, it was the ripping away from the trees, who were as much caretakers of me in that setting as the rocks, the sand, from every other plant, from the reptile, from the snakes, from the birds, from everything that was there, and especially from the spirit of the place, the many spirits of the place who had the responsibility of being my caretaker. So that breakaway would probably affect every single child who had that experience for the rest of their life, and may even go on to their children's lives, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren's lives. That's the sad part about it, and for what reason. Separation expressed in this interview then was also a separation from land, a separation from the environment in which he lived, the culture that had sustained and nourished him and oriented his worldview. This was not simply a ripping away from flesh and blood, but the destruction of a people and their way of life. The detrimental impact of these separations on the mental health of children has been widely documented by clinical psychologists like Charles Karananthis, who was from the Department of Child Welfare in Western Australia and consulted in the early 1970s. He recounts the disorienting experience for some children in the Magumba Methodist Children's Home in Western Australia. And this is our next slide. These kids would be insecure, would have anxiety. A lot of them would have nightmares and bad dreams and wake up screaming and shouting and so on. I remember one particular child couldn't sleep because when he's asleep, he would have images of people attacking him with a knife. There were other children I remember who just used to rock in their bed some days. Psychological challenges presented by removal continued into later life, are confronted during reunions, which raise a complexity of feelings ranging from trauma, grief, loneliness, guilt, anger, attachment, and gratitude. The desire to be reunited with families was not universal, and responses to the situation were individual and also varied over time. Meetings could be painful and difficult, opening up new wounds, new traumas, as much as they could be comforting and provide closure. Characteristic of the mixed feelings of reunion is an interview with Umera Edward, who recalls visiting her father's grave in 1980 and hearing from a cousin a totally new family history. So when I got there, I was highly emotional. I was fearful. I had no idea of what was going to happen. I didn't know if I'd be accepted. I was just up and down with highs, with joy, with fear, lows, hearing history about things for the first time. That, in a sense, shattered the scaffolding, the fantasy that I had built up as a child to hold me in my world together. Going home actually shattered that scaffolding, knocked it down, and replaced it with another scaffolding of family history, instead of a history that I'd built up for myself to hold me together. If you like, as a child, my whole way of seeing myself was shattered. The voices of these removed Aboriginal peoples are not simply memories of a distant past, but have been heard as part of the Bringing Them Home oral history project run by the National Library of Australia. And this major research project followed in the wake of the Bringing Them Home report of the National Inquiry into the Separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, published in 1997. And we have the front cover of it on the slide. You can download it and read it in full. It has so much testimony and detail in it. It was undertaken by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. And the outcome of this inquiry was a demand for the public acknowledgement and apology for a gross violation of human rights, as part of a series of reparations that included guarantees for non-repetition, rehabilitation, and compensation for forcible removals. On its publication, the report was received rather critically by white Australians in the conservative climate of Prime Minister John Howard, partly because of its framing in the language of international human rights that concluded that the forcible transfer of Indigenous children constituted cultural genocide under the United Nations Genocide Convention. So much so that a full public apology to Australia's Indigenous peoples did not in actual fact occur until 2008, when on the 13th of February, the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, apologised formally to the Aboriginal peoples. And even then, it was stripped of its acknowledgement of this as an act of genocide. For those stolen generations, though, this is not closure, and a recent article in Nature argues for the continued transfer of intergenerational poverty and trauma to Indigenous children living in stolen generation households. We move now to my last example. Similar generational trauma is found among China's lost generation, the millions of educated urban teenage children who during the Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong, which lasted from 1966 to the mid-1970s, either chose or were forced to leave their family homes to go and work on farms or in the mountains. This process, known as Zhangjiang, or going down to the countryside, was part of an attempt to purge the Communist Party of its bourgeois elements by closing down schools and universities in order to force feckless, privileged, city-dwelling intellectual youths to learn from working on the land with peasant farmers. The policy of forced urban to rural migration was driven by a combination of complex factors, ideological, political, and socio-economic. The concept of the bourgeoisie learning from the peasantry was linked to re-educating intellectuals and reducing the great class differences between industry and agriculture, city and countryside, and between mental and manual labour. It also served to rein in the out-of-control violence perpetrated by the Red Guards at the outset of the Cultural Revolution. And it reinforced Mao's charismatic power, since the romantic ideology of the push to the countryside, borrowed from Russia, was presented as emanating from the communist leader. It was a spectacular propaganda coup in many ways. In the aftermath of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, which had sought to transform agrarian society to a communist system, the migration was intended to stimulate the development of the countryside and border regions, just as it was a solution to urban unemployment and overpopulation. As a result of China's policy, this lost generation of educated or rusticated youth, or zhaiqing in Cantonese, emerged uneducated, without the right to live with their families, removed from where they grew up, and ultimately separated from their ideals, their sense of self, and an understanding of the country in which they lived. As a generation, the feelings and experience of separation arriving from this form of ideological state-led social engineering is quite different and distinct from what we've already observed with the Foundling Hospital or with the removal of Indigenous Aboriginal children, where children were much younger, often babies, and the psychological impact was related to the severing of familial, especially mother-child bonds. In the Chinese context, however, the youngsters were much older, aged between 15 or 16 to around 21 at the start or end of high school, and importantly, many, not all, were convinced by the romantic concept of the move to the countryside, as we can see here in this propaganda poster. Significant numbers volunteered to leave their families, having been indoctrinated by Mao's communist ideals from an early age. The Chinese writer Zhang Shenshai was born in 1948 and who was a member of the group that formed the first Red Guard organization and then moved to Inner Mongolia, remembers his youthful idealism. He writes, "I was young and idealistic. I had no idea how my mother felt. I left her thinking that I was going to the borderland to join the revolution. I even wrote the application with my blood. I left without telling her. For many others, however, migration to the countryside was enforced and not a matter of personal choice, but rather a fate to be endured with a sense of reluctant inevitability. For all Zhaiqing, irrespective of their level of zeal or resignation, the realities of life in the countryside during the Cultural Revolution was a far cry from these romantic Maoist ideals. During these years, they faced appalling conditions and hard work, poor housing, poor living environments. They were treated by the peasantry with suspicion, harshness, even violence. They faced malnutrition and starvation, sickness and accidents. And for women, it was even worse. Their prospects were terrible, with widespread sexual assault and rape and even forced marriage to male peasants. For intellectuals, they were starved of leisure time, a cultural life, a world of books and ideas. For many, it was not simply the hard work and monotony that was most discouraging, but an overwhelming sense of futility of it all. They encountered a peasantry mentality that was incompatible with communist collective ideas, and no matter how hard you worked, it was almost impossible to achieve any form of self-sufficiency. This was a collective experience that marked an entire urban generation, the lost generation. And this generation was constituted of some 17 to 18 million young educated Chinese who between 1968 and 1980 were forcibly rusticated after completing secondary school. Not only were their lives turned upside down, but also those of their parents, their siblings, and wider families. And the difficulties of understanding the impact of this separation are manifold, given the diversity of experiences and the contested memories of those who experienced the move to the countryside either nostalgically or critically. Interpretations of the period are further complicated by the political situation in contemporary China, by state censorship and official Chinese histories of the period that sought to gloss over the hardships. These constraints make it hard for historians to study the emotional and psychological impacts of separation, especially when viewed through the lens of adult memories that have themselves changed over time and are constrained by prevailing politics. Only recently have first-hand testimonies of the Zhaiqing experiences come to light. Reflecting on her plight, the 58-year-old Hu Rongfen described how my comrade sisters and I lived through some imaginably tough times, learning to live without parents and like peasants, adding, and now we want to live our youth again, all together. She recalls memories of working in icy rice fields in the spring, seeding for 10 hours, which was back-breaking work, and slapping her legs frantically to dislodge the leeches that had attached themselves to her. I still can't bear to recall my youth on the farm, she recounts, adding, if the Cultural Revolution came back and I were to be dispatched again, I'd rather commit suicide. For some urban Chinese teenagers, however, they embrace the opportunity to leave home and parents, feelings that might be reinforced if their parents were deemed enemies of the revolution, bourgeois or capitalist elements within society, defined within the so-called 5 black categories of landlords, rich farmers, counter-revolutionaries, bad influences, or rightists. For many others, they face the challenge of living away from home without parents. And much of the autobiographical testimony and oral histories show that most children maintained contact with families who were in many ways a lifeline, providing material support in the form of money or food to supplement the meager amounts derived from agricultural labour. The writer Chen Kun, for example, remembers, actually, I relied mostly on my family. This was the same with most Shanghai Zhaiqing. We were given 6 work points for each day's work. That meant I worked for more than 10 hours to earn little more than 20 cents. It was impossible to support myself. Visits home also offered vital emotional contact with parents and families for Zhaiqing who felt exiled to an alien environment out of no choice of their own. Stays varied in frequency and duration, but the 2 major holidays when Chinese families got together, Chinese New Year and the Mid-Autumn Festival, were the most popular times to travel home. It was much easier to travel in the spring when there was a lull in agricultural work, but many farms only allowed people to return every 2 years, with some waiting 3 or 4 years before they saw their families again. Others were unable to afford to travel or were prevented from seeing family members because they were scattered by the impact of the Cultural Revolution. Homesickness and loneliness, therefore, was rife among the Zhaiqueng, and official attempts to prevent travel in order to sever family ties and promote integration with the peasant masses backfired, exacerbating feelings of longing and resentment at being kept against their will. The Zhaiqueng missed their families. Some openly disobeyed orders, only to be forcibly brought back if caught. Others requested to return home, citing family reasons. Not only was separation painful, but it was also against prevailing Chinese customs, with demonstrators using emotive slogans such as "flesh and bones need to be reunited." The family was a fundamental building block of Chinese society. The term lost generation, then, has been used to describe this generation of displaced urban Chinese youth who were bound together perhaps more than any other generation by shared experiences and hardships. Lost refers not only to the loss of educational opportunities, but also to the loss of the youthful idealism with which they were raised as children. The harsh living conditions took their toll on many, with considerable loss of life of those unable to endure the hardships. Moreover, the lasting term psychological impact of these policies is immeasurable for the millions of Chinese people who missed out on their teenage years. The wounds and anger are visceral, but also observable are feelings of nostalgia for being part of this generation who had all experienced the same thing, and a pride in their heroism. By way of conclusion, and I'm drawing my talk to an end now, I'd like to just bring together the disparate strands of these 3 distinct sets of stories of child-parent separation. 18th century British infants orphaned as a result of grinding poverty, social prejudice and intolerance. Aboriginal children removed through racist policies of cultural erasure, and lost Chinese teenagers rusticated in line with political ideologies. Despite their historically contingent differences, deep structural commonalities span the centuries and continents and resonate today around contemporary issues of trauma, dislocation, upbringing and care, reconciliation and healing. One of the strongest themes to emerge is that of lost childhoods, which manifests itself in deeply personal and collective experiences. The lost years and shattered ideals of China's urban youth during the Cultural Revolution are echoed in the experiences of foundlings and indigenous people removed from their families and homes to be brought up in care. In most societies, concepts of family and home convey meanings about identity, about comfort, safety, and connection. Removal could thus lead to a profound sense of powerlessness. These narratives of separation are repeatedly filled with feelings of homesickness, grief, sadness, with mothers in particular as central figures of emotional longing. It was mothers these children in these homes were crying about in the middle of the night. A second theme to emerge is a sense of displacement and loneliness resulting from abandonment or removal. Children being forced to move from one unfamiliar environment to another without a stabilizing adult presence or anchorage of home life, but instead left to make sense of their confusing worlds all on their own. And the impact of these childhood separations of the past continue into the present as their long-term legacy is felt in terms of psychological trauma, identity, and impaired emotional development. And many carry with them the scars of lost, stolen, or broken childhoods, which lead to mental health problems, imprisonment, addiction, relationship, and identity issues. Throughout the past, attitudes towards child rearing have shifted over time and place, with what today are termed blended families found across societies throughout history. The state intervened in various ways to disrupt parent-child relations and patterns of upbringing, girded by what they saw as moral or legal justifications. Viewed from the parent's perspective, separation from children elicits trans-historical feelings and emotions. As the editors of Many Voices, Reflections on Experience of Indigenous Child Separation write, The fear of losing a child is a universal feeling, transcending social, political, cultural, and racial. And many mothers, biological as well as foster mothers, struggled with abandoning or leaving their children, or having their children removed. Individuals responded in different ways. While some bottled up emotions, buried them deep inside, others tried to maintain some form of contact and even sought reunions. Amidst these themes of separation, abandonment, loss, and identity, powerful movements of healing, forgiveness, rehabilitation, and ascendancy resurrect themselves. The Zhai-Qing, for example, bound together through shared experience. The Bringing Them Home report ushered in a process of public policy and restitution, uncovering a legacy of the past that is common to so many Indigenous peoples around the world. And to turn to our opening example, as part of the Canadian government's apology to the First Nation peoples, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, visited a middle school in the Cowes First Nation, Saskatchewan, on the 6th of July, 2021, the site of the discovery of around 751 unmarked graves, to sign an accord allowing the community to control child welfare services themselves. From trauma, thus comes agency and empowerment. Child-parent separations, however, are a brutal reality in the world in which we live today, as human tragedies unfold themselves before our very eyes on a daily basis. Children are orphaned around the world through war, famine, and environmental disaster. And one sees on our TV screens and reads in the newspapers at the moment heartbreaking scenes emanating from Afghanistan as the Taliban sweep to power. Desperate Afghan parents handing babies to soldiers over the security fences at Kabul airport in the hope that they might escape to a better life. Refugee Afghan children arriving in the UK for asylum, all alone, separated from their homeland, with no interpreters, no shoes, no spare clothes, not even something to keep the rain off, driven from one end of the country to the other in taxis, housed in drab, unholy, unsuitable accommodation, clutching a teddy or colouring book handed to them by a volunteer. One can only imagine how terrifying these ordeals are for these young children and the future stories of separation that they will have to tell.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that talk. It was rather a surreal experience sitting back in my study here, viewing it myself. What we're going to do now is we're going to have about half an hour. It's just gone 8 o'clock. We're going to have about half an hour of questions, and people have very kindly put a whole range of questions in the chat here or in the Q&A function. So I'm going to try and sort of answer them in turn. Some of you put questions quite early on, so I'll try and get to those. They're coming in thick and fast now. I can't hope to get through all of these or have expertise on all of them, but I will do my very best. A colleague from Plymouth, who is an expert on early childhood education, has posted several really interesting questions, which I'll try and answer. One of these questions is about, it says, in undertaking the research, did you get a sense as to whether only some stories are told or heard? And what about stories of mothers and children that have not been documented? This was in particular in relation to the Foundling Hospital. I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's answered in a very sort of procedural way about what survives in the archive and the particular construction of that archive. I think what you have in each case is a petition from a mother who wants her child to be sent to the Foundling Hospital because she finds herself in circumstances where she is not able to look after him or her. And so what you have at that stage is an extraordinary amount of autobiographical detail of her circumstances. And so in terms of the women who are petitioning, those survive in literally their thousands. So you can trawl through them. They are in the letter books. The question though asks, what does that miss out? I mean, of course, it misses out a whole load of women who were unable to deposit their children, or felt inhibited in being able to do that, weren't literate enough, didn't have time to be able to do this. Then we have an extraordinary range of tokens, and these are either small items, small objects, or they are pieces of embroidery that are a sort of material snapshot of a mother parting from her child. And these little swatches of fabric or little objects would then be put with the petition as part of the child's documents, and that would then be saved. All of the stuff that I was talking about, where mothers correspond wanting to see their children or have news about their children, we are talking there about a minority of mothers. For many of the mothers who abandoned their children to the care of the foundling hospital, they never saw their children again and had no contact at all. But we have quite a significant archive of mothers, who want some kind of form of contact. So doubtless there are, of course, enormous silences in that. The difficulty, as always, as I think I said at the outset of the talk, is actually recovering the childhood perspective. And that's really difficult to get. It's only when these children are much older, they're almost going into service, and at that point there's some contact, and particularly for later periods, once you get into the late 19th, early 20th century, that interwar period, you get a much broader picture. And I think it's patchy and uneven, and yes, absolutely there are gaps, and actually you're dealing with really complex ranges of sources. So you're dealing with things that are strictly letters, but then you're also dealing with material objects. And how do you read material objects of emotion? And there's all sorts of work that's been done on this. There's a recent collection called Objects of Feeling, in which John Stiles, who I mentioned him as the great historian who put together a wonderful collection, Threads of Feeling. He looks at these tokens from the perspective of how you read the emotions into the objects. Now, your previous question was about the sense in which the way in which the foundling hospital was organized contributes to disciplining of female behavior, women's bodies, and the extent to which it also disciplined children. I think yes, absolutely. I think I find the extraordinary act of making such a public performance of abandoning your child. So we're kind of, almost a sort of confessional narrative to get your child in, and then having to go along in person and then go through the rigmarole of a ballot, I find absolutely extraordinary. And if you compare that to many of the anonymous systems that we see in continental Europe, I think that is very much after. It's very much after. It's very much after kind of trying to control women's bodies and women's behavior. And of course, female chastity has always been policed in many ways. I mean, certainly in medieval, early modern society, it's always been policed in varying forms, either by the parish that sought to sort of control the way in which women behaved. It's clamped down on adultery. Women who are caught as adulteresses would quite simply have to stand outside the church on a Sunday morning with a placard around their neck, basically saying that, accusing them of adultery. So an absolute sort of public humiliation. And I think one of the things that actually your question really provoked me to think about parallels between medieval and early modern shaming rituals that basically shame people because of particular sort of forms of social behavior, sexual indiscretions. There are definitely residues and echoes of that in this very sort of public sort of process by which you got your children into the hospital. There was a question before that about what attempts were made to trace fathers. One of the really fascinating things, if you're looking at the history of the Foundling Hospital, is fathers are often really absent. If you think about it structurally, many of the women are basically, their whole case for having their children accepted into the hospital is because they have been let down by husbands. Husbands have sort of got them pregnant, or men have got them, fathers have got them, the fathers of the child have obviously got them pregnant and then gone away. Sometimes the fathers are there, but the couple is in great poverty. So it's not about tracing fathers there, but little attempt is actually made to chase fathers in the way that the parish, the early modern parish, would do, because the parish didn't want an unmarried mother having to be supported. But it's interesting how actually throughout all of these three different case studies that I talked about, it is the mother figure that is the strongest figure throughout, and fathers are very much sort of liminal figures. They crop up in the narratives, in the Foundling Hospital only in circumstances. Fathers do not maintain contact afterwards. They crop up in the Aboriginal oral histories as figures, and there's some attempt to reconnect with fathers. Later on, there was a very touching account of a daughter who found her out about her parentage and then went to visit the grave of her father. Fathers are much more present in the sort of Chinese testimonies that we're talking about. There was then a really interesting question about that I'm not really an expert on, but a very interesting question from Russell, who's coming from a group that's interested in challenging the value to individuals and society of early boarding, having boarded himself from the age of 7, and he's interested to know whether there's some sort of crossover in communications. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I'd love to do is explore boarding school in much more detail. And it's something that I'm very much aware of. I think as soon as boarding schools are established, you can absolutely find the same level of records for boarding schools. The thing with the Foundling Hospital is that the Foundling Hospital as an institution preserves archival materials relating to people there. Because they're orphans, so they're maintaining that archive because just in case parents want to come or mothers want to come back and claim their children. With boarding schools, they don't preserve documents from parents to children. However, if you go to family collections, you will find tons of material, tons of letter collections where children are writing home, and exactly the kinds of issues that we're confronting about poor conditions, separation, abuse, longing, all of those kinds of things will be seen. One of the most brilliant examples that I've got comes from the period of Henry VIII, so the 1530s. There's a wonderful collection of 6 volumes of letters from the Lisle family, and the Lisles are based in Calais. They're related to Henry VIII. There's a big sort of hoo-ha where Lord Lisle, who's the deputy lieutenant of Calais garrison, is basically accused of treason. So the state moves in, confiscates the entire family letter collection, all their papers. It gets impounded as part of a treason trial and ends up in the state papers. And it means that we have a snapshot of almost every aspect of family life in a Tudor family, an elite family, in Henry VIII's reign. And there are several examples there of children, boys and girls, who are away from parents. Now, there's a young boy called, a particularly precocious James Bassett, is away at school in France, and he's being educated in France because, as part of the aristocratic Tudor elite, they are wanting to make those kinds of social and political and cultural connections with the local French elite, which is very much why, you know, the people send their kids away to boarding school, because it's seen as a sort of very good way of networking and socializing people, their offspring, and perpetuating that sort of social advantage. But yet you read these, and all of these sort of tensions in the experience of it come through. And there are children who are being beaten. There's a lovely sort of bit where this 10-year-old boy is corresponding with his mother and saying, "Don't believe my letters unless they are sealed with my own seal, because my tutor makes me write them." And there are boys here who are being beaten. So I think you could find it as early as that. I think you could definitely find it for the 17th, 18th century. If you read Henry French's book on masculinity, I remember him giving a splendid talk on that. And there's a lot of discussion about boys away at school. And you talk about the Spartan tradition. I think there's very much there's a lot of discussion there about how boarding schools inculcated codes of masculinity, but also through kind of more or less ritual abuse and corporal punishment. So I hope that answers your question. We've got a question about the history of separation more broadly, and how I came to this. You'll forgive me while I just take some water. It's been a very long week, and I've been talking a lot, talking all day. So how did I come to write a big book on separation and then look at children? I think there are two real sort of pivotal points here. One is that I'm a historian who has looked at letters across time. And letters are, or as Michel Foucault would talk about, they are technologies. And I define them as technologies of separation. In other words, they are modes of communication that come into being because people are separated over time. So I've studied that for a long time. And then the idea came to me in lockdown, and we were suddenly all in supposedly a global 24-hour society. We were suddenly all separated. We were locked down, we weren't allowed out, schools were closed. And you were sort of forced back onto your, something that was particularly local, peculiarly sort of contained within your household. And it made me think about, what about doing a big history of separation? And I'd been reading various brilliant books that I'd read recently. One on Joanna Book's Big History on Fear, Faye Alberti's brilliant book on the cultural history of loneliness. And what I wanted to do was a similarly sort of global and expansive topic. And the way that the book is going to be organized is it's around themes. So there are big sections. The children comes into the life cycle section that looks at children and parents, separation, love and the road to divorce, old age and loneliness, and death. And then there's a section around spaces. So looking at spatiality and the built environment and how different types of building might structure separation. So the excellent question from Russell prompted me to talk about boarding schools. Boarding schools would be one example. So how does that kind of lived experience operate? Or we could think about monasteries and monasticism and spirituality, or we could think about prisons, or in our current sort of climate, we could also think about hospitals and containment in that way. And then there are, in a sort of true Brodelian sort of sense, a sort of big sort of macro history, there are I am also keen on looking at big historical movements and shifts over time. So looking at emigration and diaspora, war, empire, segregation, separatism. Excuse me while I cough. I will just have another slurp of water. And then I'm also interested in looking at on the margins, so marginality and how people and how people negotiate themselves. I mean, I think one of the big arguments is that as we sort of we're seemingly as time goes on, looking at an increasingly compressed world in terms of time and space, which would take a very sort of Marxist approach to it. But basically, if you see the world becoming smaller and more joined up and more entangled, which seems to me where global history is going, there's also a really interesting history that alongside that also goes a history of separation, you know, in that empire takes people away from home. And how do they negotiate? How do they navigate that kind of experience? You know, even with our own world today, and you know, and fast travel and digital communication, and we're all on Zoom, so we can be, you know, spread across the world and in the same moment. In some ways, that is a sort of an experience of separation. You know, you are kind of atomized in a particular sort of digital world. So I wanted to sort of explore that. And the other thing that I wanted to explore was actually that I think separation is something that is part of everyday life, that it is sort of lived experience. It's a quotidian experience. You'll excuse me, I'm losing my voice. And so I think that's something that I also wanted to explore. And also I think it's also not necessarily something that is actually physical. It's something that can also be mental. And that's what I wanted to get at on the margins. So looking at loners and outsiders and that sort of thing. How does this topic fit into my research on separation? I think we've talked about that. We've talked about the lack of fathers. Oh God, the role of historians playing in the present. Are there any lessons from the past? Oh my gosh, that's a sort of big sort of multi-million-dollar question about the value of historians. I think if I were thinking that through, so what does this history of childhood separation have to tell us? I think where I would start at is, it's an incredibly difficult question to answer. I think I'd start with a sort of methodological sort of statement that I don't think history has any lessons to teach us in a sort of strict sense, in that history is so unique and historically contingent. So mining it for lessons of the past and then applying them to the future, except in the most general kind of banal sense, isn't really what historians should do. I think a knowledge of the past, though, does inform decisions of the future. And I think historical study of residential care or child abuse, and there's some very important work being done at the moment on the history of child abuse, I mean, undoubtedly forms part of government policy around such matters. And there's an institute at King's London called the History and Policy Unit, and basically it's a mechanism for linking historians to policymakers. So I think in that sort of sense, one can take this kind of history and feed it into public government policy. I think the other thing to think about is that actually the past is deeply traumatic on a sort of macro as well as micro level, and I think one can't escape it. And one of the things that I tried to sort of push across is the idea that the past is actually there. It's there in these indigenous peoples, in the grief, the grievances, the trauma that is felt. and the example that I started with and ended with is the way in which history and the way in which people have been treated and marginalized feeds into contemporary debate and contemporary situation. And so, you know, the ceremony on Canada Day, the way in which that history has then fed into the decision to actually give Indigenous peoples back control over their own children, I think is really important. I also think the different, but also similarly interesting, is the sense of generation, lost generation in China. I think is something that people are still dealing with, either in a sort of nostalgic sense, or in a critical sense, but in a sense that they are bound together as a cohort that has really gone through this. I think on a personal level, lessons from the past. I think one of the most intriguing things is, and I got struck by this listening to the oral histories of Aboriginal children or adults who were remembering back to their childhoods. And I think in a sense, it's, you know, on a personal level, it's your personal roots, your sense of yourself, your past, your family, your heritage builds you as a person. And I think once that gets stripped away, once those pillars are gone, your identity becomes very slippery. And so I think to answer that question, it's actually really layered. It's a really complex question. It's not about strict lessons that can be applied, but actually it's a sort of deep sensitivity to the way in which the past is continually laced into the present. So I hope that answered that question. There's another question about challenging. Did you find it challenging working with upsetting and clearly disturbing topics? Yeah, absolutely. As a historian, you deal with challenging and difficult things all the time, which I had from very early on, you know, and confronted that at school, learning about the Holocaust or learning about slavery. You know, you're dealing with hugely traumatic things. I was quite struck by how, particularly the foundling hospitals, I found that really troubling. Just personally, I found it quite difficult to work with that material, particularly the tokens. And I suppose some of that is the perspective of as a father, and with two young girls. I think the discipline always, as a historian, is we're trained in a sense of objectivity, and I mean, it's really hard to explain that to people who aren't practicing historians, and historians are always critiqued by any other discipline for this. But I think it's a sense of perspective and, you know, and impartial judgment, and that's quite difficult to always maintain, particularly when you're dealing with this side of things. Let me have a look. So there is a series of questions about would some women have helped these women partition as they may have been would people have helped them petition? Yes, absolutely. They would often have people who would write letters for them. So if they were illiterate, illiteracy wouldn't be a barrier. You would get somebody to write on your behalf. So yes, absolutely. And and would this help to indicate their class? Yes, I think so. Absolutely. And one of the things also is if you look at the petitions, the phonetic spelling also gives you a sense of their educational ability. You know, so, you know, and if you have a look at the orthography, the embroidery, one of the really interesting things about the embroidery is, and this is why one of the reasons John Styles is so interested in the Foundling collection, is that it is actually one of the best records that we have of what ordinary women wore in London at that time, because they're little sort of swatches of their clothing. So I think it's some thousands of items of this survive. So you get a sense of the sort of the rich cottons and fabrics that survive. But they are absolutely extraordinary artifacts. There's a new exhibition that's going on at the Foundling Hospital by Helen Berry, and I was very intrigued. I loved reading her book, Orphans of Empire. If you haven't seen it, it's a wonderful book, and it's trying to do imperial history with the Foundling Hospital. But there's this wonderful diary that she's discovered of a foundling boy who ends up at the Battle of Trafalgar, and the book is just beautifully structured. So there's constantly this theme of this journal going through it, but you don't actually get the sort of narrative arc of it right until the end. So it works beautifully. Let me check. I've got in the chat. People aren't telling me to shut up yet, so maybe I'll just answer one more question. Oral history interviews. Are there difficulties of using oral history interviews? Yes, there are real problems. I mean, this is a whole field that has developed, and I have a colleague at Plymouth, Darren Oyaki, who is a world expert in this and far more qualified to talk to you about this than me. I don't normally work on oral histories. I teach it. I know how to use it. I think the standard difficulties are, as I tried to sort of relay, essentially what you've got is somebody in their old age looking back on their childhood, and there is a disconnect between their sort of filtered memory and what actually happened. So as soon as you understand that and understand the kind of control environment that you're operating in, I think that's fine. People will recall different things. They will look at things with hindsight. I think it's also ripe for psychological analysis, which I don't do with it. I'm not a trained psychologist or psychiatrist. If you look at the sort of forefront of oral history, it's very theoretical, and that's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to sort of unpick and let the testimony speak for itself, as it were. But yes, very problematic. In some ways, there are parallels between the petitions, because I think there is an oral residue in the petitions themselves, particularly when, as our questioner asked about the dictated or written, or letters written by others, there where dictation takes place, there is a sort of an oral register there that I think is quite similar. I think I'm being told that it is the witching hour. We're past 8:30. I'm sorry if I didn't get to any of your questions for those people who looked at this. If anyone would like to get in touch with me, and there are any issues that you'd like to pick up, you can email me at my university email account, and I'd love to hear from you. And meanwhile, just a huge thank you for all of you who've taken time out of busy schedules to come along to the talk this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed researching this and writing it and answering your questions now. I thought the questions were superb. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the evening and a great weekend. And I think in the chat there is about to be a form that you can go. It says, please, can you fill out a feedback form? We have to collect evidence and data of these kinds of things, particularly for our funders, our generous funders. So I just wish you all well, and take care. Okay, bye.